Dungeons & Dragons 2023 Honor Among Thieves is a movie set in the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game setting of Forgotten Realms, and it is a huge gamble. There's a lot riding on the success of this movie, and we are currently bearing witness to one of the biggest moments in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Almost as big as that time when Tom Hanks went to throw himself off a building to join the Great Hall. He knew the flight spell. He was this close to greatness. But nevertheless, a budget of at least 150 million USD, although almost certainly 150 million more when we take into account marketing costs, Honor Among Thieves is the first major flag planted by Hasbro in a whole new business model for role-playing games. And in a space that Dungeons & Dragons has traditionally performed poorly in, I think it's fair to say, with the D&D movie trilogy of the early 2000s not quite eclipsing Lord of the Rings in cultural relevancy. Some might call it the Willow of its generation. But Hasbro have thrown a lot of money into supporting Honor Among Thieves because they believe that D&D can be a billion-dollar brand like Lord of the Rings, Marvel, and Star Wars. All great movie franchises without a shred of problems. And this movie is the test. Honor Among Thieves finally asks the question, does the D&D brand resonate with mainstream audiences? And can Hasbro convert an audience interested in movies into one interested in D&D? Because let me tell you, my local DM is doing a piss-poor job of it. Your game sucks, Gary. Real rude. And sure, in the past, D&D has been pretty attractive to mainstream audiences that don't know much about role-playing games. But that's usually because D&D has been nested within an existing franchise. Stranger Things, for instance, garnered a ton of great press for its use of D&D and exposed the brand to a ton of new people. But Stranger Things wasn't a D&D show. It was a Spielberg King sci-fi horror nostalgia pie that happened to occasionally feature D&D. And Sam from Lord of the Rings. D&D hasn't yet been proven to be able to stand on its own as a brand and pull in mainstream audiences yet. We're not quite at the stage of kids wearing Dritz costumes at Halloween. Probably for the best that they don't, honestly. And taken within the context of Hasbro CEO recently saying that Dungeons & Dragons is an under-monetized brand, it's hard not to see Honor Among Thieves as so much more than just another Hollywood blockbuster movie. This is the beginning of a new era of Dungeons & Dragons, especially when it comes to its new future as a multi-billion-dollar franchise. A treatment which famously has gone really well for the likes of the Lord of the Rings. That's a joke, son, a jip. Honor Among Thieves opens the door to a whole new platform of monetization that would have been undreamed of 25 years ago. A canvas from which Hasbro can sell plushies, toys, games, and Happy Meals to a wide audience. Taking the D&D franchise from your mom's basement into the slightly more depressing Batman Forever commercialized stratosphere. So has the movie succeeded in this goal? Has it unfurled its robe of power and exposed mainstream audiences to the D&D brand? Has Honor Among Thieves demonstrated that the D&D IP is a strong enough draw to pull in viewers the way that Marvel, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars can? And the answer is complicated, but probably no, and I'm sure there'll be people celebrating that. There'll be many people who are happy about the fact that this movie seems to be failing to make a suitable financial return, and it's starting to look like we're not going to get a sequel or even a return to the universe on the big screen anytime soon. Probably Chris Pine will be loving it because I sold him a lot of speed when he was filming the movie over here. A lot of speed. But I'm not celebrating this. For one, if this movie fails, then there are huge implications for the wider D&D franchise and what players can expect to see in the future. And here's a hint. It's really, really bad. But also, the movie was good, and I think it deserved to do well at the box office. And you might be a little confused here if you watched my video last week calling Dungeons & Dragons 2023 Honor Among Thieves trash, or a comprehensive deep dive into the Iraq War, and one of the worst movies ever made and I want to gouge my own eyes out rather than think of it ever again. But in my defense of that review, I had in actuality watched the 2000 movie Dungeons & Dragons, the first one that they ever made. And all of those statements are true about the 2000 movie, except for the Iraq War bit. The 2000s D&D movie predated the Iraq War. If you really want a great analysis of the Iraq War in a movie, then check out 1997's hit Starship Troopers. Also, I made that video on April 1st, and I might not have been entirely serious, which is very rare for me. Again, take took this down. It is admissible in court. I really did sell Chris Pine a ton of speed. This week, though, I did actually watch Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, and I went into it pretty cynical, which might surprise you. I genuinely expected to hate this movie. And that's not just because I'm a Grinch whose heart is filled with misery and gloom, but also because, well, I'm not really a fan of most blockbusters these days. I spent all my wonder 20 years ago, and I'm done now. The Star Wars prequels cost me a lot. This is the best me I can be. But I don't watch a lot of blockbusters these days. I'm not a fan of Marvel. I'm not a fan of the whole Will Wheaton-esque everything's equipped dialogue. And overall, my idea of a swell time is watching a woman emerge from a radiator to sing a song about heaven while we try not to think about fatherhood. In other words, Honor Among Thieves isn't exactly the type of movie that gets me out to a big premiere at the cinema very often. The last movie I saw in the cinema with other people was Pink Velvet 3, A Lesbian Odyssey. 3 out of 5 stars. And this is D&D. And Chris Cox, I guess, got me because by God, just like all the boys at his cocktail club, I wanted to see what D&D looks like when translated to the big screen. So I went to see it and I had a blast! I really enjoyed this movie. I'm not going to go into spoilers here, but the movie overall felt exactly like a D&D campaign. It genuinely struck me that this movie very easily could have been based on someone's actual D&D campaign and had the exact vibe of someone recounting their adventure, except, you know, interesting to listen to. There were moments that resonated with me as an actual player, such as magical items being produced out of nowhere to solve field traps, and then that magical item later going on to be used in extremely imaginative and gamey ways that definitely would have been unexpected and frustrating for a DM. The party constantly messed up, they fielded traps, and they embodied their class archetypes very well. And the big plotline felt very personal to the characters until they were sort of railroaded into dealing with the big bad at the end, which basically feels like every single game of D&D that I've ever been a part of. Gary. And the characters 100% felt like a hodgepodge band of adventures that really had no business working with one another, but they sort of had to because, hey, it's the game. Ultimately, the biggest compliment that I can give it is that the movie felt very true to the spirit of playing Dungeons & Dragons rather than simply being a generic fantasy movie with a coat of paint. If you enjoy the action-adventure playstyle of D&D, then I recommend the movie. I thought it was fun. I thought it captured D&D very well, and it wasn't embarrassed by the genre, the way that D&D 2000 was embarrassed by the setting. There's a ton of iconic spells in here like Bigsby's Hand, and there's lots of little references that demonstrate there's a lot of love for the game in this movie. I have some nitpicks. There are some inaccuracies to the mechanics of the game. It really doesn't let mechanics of the game get in the way of a good story, but that's fine. The movie didn't blow me away, it's unlikely to change anyone's life, and the message of the story was relatively insubstantial and not exactly transcendent. But it's a fine, lazy Sunday morning movie and had plenty of comedic bits. Sure, it was a little bit Guardians of the Galaxy banter heavy, but the plot has plenty of twists and turns. I've heard some complaints about certain elements in the film, such as a Supermax prison, for example. How could there be a tax base for this type of Supermax project in a medieval setting? Well, the prison shown in the movie is a panopticon, actually, and that style of prison wasn't invented until the late 18th century by moral reformer Jeremy Bentham. So this is a lovely reminder from the get-go that the movie isn't set in a medieval world, but one in a fantasy setting, where questions about the economy are given as much thought as the questions about the magical properties of spandex in a superhero movie. The movie doesn't work on that level. It's not designed to. My favorite character in the entire movie was a DMPC paladin called Zank, and he was overly serious and had some absolutely banger lines that had me laughing every single time. He really did feel like a higher level character that was dropped into the game and then whisked away before you could steal the spotlight from the actual player characters. And it's those little indefinable elements that made it really feel like Dungeons & Dragons, where if you don't play the game, you'll probably miss it. But if you do play it, then you'll recognize a story being fudged to help a party out. There's a little bit of postmodern meta element to this movie, and I really liked it. I thought it was fun. And overall, people seem to be agreeing with me. As far as I can tell, critic and audience reviews are pretty much satisfied by the movie. So for that reason, I'm sorry to see that it seems to be underperforming at the box office, because it is. The great big invisible Bigsby's Hand of the market is giving a big old companies thumbs down or up. I can't remember which one meant. That was a very mixed metaphor. Anyway, Honor Among Thieves has opened to only $38.5 million over a 3-day period at the domestic box office. Globally, it's made $71 million, and which, while all of that sounds really, really good if it's in your bank account, unfortunately, that's not the case when it comes to the scale that Hollywood operates on, especially when compared to the budget of over $150 million. It's still early days, and word of mouth could really help this movie out, but currently it is in line to be a bit of a flop. And ironically, if this movie had come out like 20 years ago, I think it would have worked. The movie is good and will get great word of mouth, which 2 decades ago would have translated to really great DVD sales, possibly guaranteeing a sequel. Unfortunately, it's not 20 years ago. Alas, Jeremy Irons does not still look this good. Oh wait, no, yes he does. He looks fantastic. What is he, 70? Wow. But movies can't make their money back with DVD sales anymore. It's all streaming these days. Or flicking aimlessly around Netflix, not sure what to watch. And you get it. This means that we're unlikely to get a sequel, which is a huge blow to the Hasbro franchise department, who I am sure were probably hoping that this would be the beginning of a wider cinematic multiverse. If the question of this movie was whether the D&D brand was bringing much to the table, then apparently the answer is no, not really. Not when it comes to marketing anyway. And that has huge implications for the future of D&D. It's really bad for Hasbro, but it's really bad for us players too. Honor Among Thieves has been consistently sold to Hasbro investors as a huge advertisement for D&D to a general audience. Something about the massive billboards everywhere, I guess. And yes, the movie simply existing acts as a huge advertisement for D&D generally. When you see an advert for the D&D movie, you sort of get an advert for the D&D game too. But having the movie bomb is actually quite an indictment on the entire enterprise of creating the whole D&D franchise thing. Yes, people at cocktail parties apparently know what D&D is, but does that matter if they don't care enough to watch a movie set in a D&D setting? Is it a brand that compels people to spend money to watch stories told in that universe? Is it a setting that compels enough people to buy toys? The box office currently suggests no, which is awful for Hasbro executives when their plan was to make D&D brand a cultural touchstone. It's like a Backstreet Boys reunion tour. Everyone knows what it is. It doesn't mean that anybody will pay to see it. I would though. Probably not. Honor Among Thieves wasn't really being advertised to gamers. It was being shown to attendees at Comic-Con. It was talked about on movie websites. It was showing up as a trailer in front of Marvel movies. Hasbro needed this movie to work out so that they could create and sell a ton of branded toys and monetize the brand the way that Chris Cox has promised that he would. Through the classic Hasbro Blueprint 2.0, where they'll build movies based on their existing IP properties, and then create toys around that movie, and then use those toys to build games and other media, and then build movies on the back of that media. Movie leads to merchandise, which leads to books, which leads to more movie forever and ever, and ever and ever and ever, forever and ever and ever. Spinning the brand to greater and greater money-making heights like a dog that eats its own vomit. It is a wheel of pain that goes ever onwards. Welcome to the future of culture, calcified and commodified concurrently around a collective cacophony of corporate commercial cack. On and on we go. The intention of this movie was to increase the appeal of D&D to a wider market, but because that doesn't seem to have worked here, Hasbro will have to come up with a new strategy, a Blueprint 3.0, and that's what scares me. If going wide doesn't work, then what's open to them? Well, you have to go deep on the audience that you do have. This means that there'll be an ever greater emphasis on monetizing the existing D&D audience in order to pull that $1 billion that Hasbro investors expect from Wizards of the Coast, like a pimp that needs its cut. The audience isn't growing, but the amount of money being swallowed up by the company has to. This will incentivize Hasbro to experiment with more ways and avenues with which to monetize the existing niche audience of players. We already know that the virtual tabletop system is on the way. We know that it will have a marketplace, and we know that it will be pushed as the best way to play D&D in the future. If you want to imagine what this looks like, look at other niche nerd properties like Warhammer and Magic the Gathering. These are properties that don't have a great great cultural penetration in mainstream culture, but they make way more money than Dungeons & Dragons. How? Well, by virtue of being predatory and abusive, rolling updates, constant new releases that compel players to continually spend, a reliance on fear of missing out marketing, gambling elements like card booster packs, cross-franchising, constant power creep, overwhelming releases, power increases, a reliance on a small number of users who disproportionately spend an extreme amount of money, unethical, unnecessary monetization, and the commodification of our hobbies to an excessive degree. This is a future of Dungeons & Dragons that I'm worried about. And D&D turning this way grows ever more likely if Hasbro think that there's no other way to monetize the D&D brand. So yeah, that really terrifies me. And I think it should scare other players too. Be afraid! Be very afraid! And if you want to see the greatest movie review ever made, then check out my April Fool's video here. Seriously, it has to be seen to be believed. It might be the greatest video I've ever made. And a huge thanks to my patrons, especially Sonic Bread and Crypto Kev. And I'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye!